So I'm Dean Howard Schneider. I know most of you, but in case there are people in the audience who have never come to one of these events, this is another edition in a program we call My Life As, in which the journalism school brings to campus some of the top journalists in the United States and even from around the world. And over the past 7 years, we've brought more than 50 journalists here. Many of them who have won major Emmy Awards and Pulitzer Prizes. And tonight you have a very special treat. For the price of your admission, yes, you are not getting one, but you are getting two of the most accomplished journalists in the United States. Bill Dedman, who is to my right, is a longtime investigative reporter. He won the Pulitzer Prize, the highest prize in journalism, in 1989 for an investigation he did on discrimination in lending practices by mortgage companies when he was at Atlanta. Can you hear me? I want to make sure. He went on to NBC and MSNBC, where he investigated abuses at Guantanamo, lots of other stories. While he was at NBC, he stumbled upon a story that would consume him, that would wind up eventually as a best-selling book, reach the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list. He then went to Newsday and News 12 Long Island, where he currently is an investigative reporter, and most recently did a story about how easy it is to smuggle a serrated knife onto an airplane. Okay, doesn't make us too comfortable, does it? Pam Belluck, who happens to be his wife, is currently a health and science reporter at the New York Times. Last year, she was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Ebola. In particular, Pam worked on a real groundbreaking story about how doctors dramatically and catastrophically underestimated the extent and the exposure to this disease, and therefore really weren't able to cope with the outbreak. And Ebola is still in the news. If you saw last week, there is a victim, a Scottish nurse who everyone thought was recovered, I won't say cured, and it turned out that the disease has resurfaced months later, and she's in the hospital in critical condition. Pam was a national bureau chief, did lots of stories for the New York Times. She specializes now in stories about reproductive health, about neuroscience. She did a story about the largest extended family in the world to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, 5,000 people. Together they have a remarkable body of work. And tonight we're going to hear from them individually and collectively about their life and their work. Okay, so I'm going to start first. Join with me in welcoming Bill Dedman, please.
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? You're going to make a pain noise at some point when you can't hear us? Let us know that. Okay. Nick, will you come down? Come on down. I want to introduce you to Nick. Are there any Mets fans here? So I know you're missing the game. I know you've been conscripted, and you have to be here. But Nick's going to watch. Nick is the one. He's the only one who's going to keep up with the score of the game. All right? Okay. So Nick's going to watch the score, and whenever this, you just have a seat. Whenever the score changes, Nick's just going to come down here and update that for us. Okay, that's the plan. Because I don't want to miss it. We are excited to be here. Howie, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. And thank you to the faculty who are here and to the students who are shanghaied into being here. We've noticed that the journalism school at Stony Brook is a great model for how to marry traditional investigative and public service journalism practices and values with a broader effort to reach out with news literacy for the broader public. It's really a remarkable thing that we put together. We've been asked to talk a little bit about ourselves, which makes us uncomfortable because we're in the business of keeping ourselves out of the stories and focusing on the story itself. But we're going to try. I want to take just a minute to introduce us by telling you how Pam and I met. It was Atlanta in the fall of 1987, and there was a riot at the prison. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary had been taken over by the prisoners, who were mostly not felons who had committed crimes in the United States, but who were detainees who had come over from Cuba in the boat lift. A lot of refugees had fled Cuba, and along with that flood of refugees, Castro had opened his jails. And a lot of those criminals ended up in prison in Atlanta. They took over the prison, and this riot lasted for 11 days. So one November night, Pam and I both had the same idea. We had heard that there was a breakout or something was going to happen that night. We wanted to get a better view, and we were not the sort of reporters to sit around outside waiting for information to be handed out. So we had both gone over the fence and onto the grounds of the prison, not inside the wall where it was dangerous, but onto the grounds inside the fence, where we were not supposed to be. We were both working for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as reporters. Pam had gotten out of college, had gone to the Philippines as a stringer, a reporter, and caught on with newspapers, gotten a lot of clips in the Philippines after Marcos had fallen. And it was back in the United States, was in her first full-time daily newspaper journalism job. I'd come up through small newspapers in the South,
Sugar.
and we were working at the same paper, but we hadn't met. And so we met there at the prison. We were standing on the grounds of the prison when an armored personnel carrier from the FBI came over the hill with a light and said, "Halt." So we did, and we were interrogated together by the FBI for a while, and then they let us go. This was our first date. If I had known how dangerous it was, I would not have gone over the fence, because, you know, as a result, we've been married for 22 years, and now we have 2 teenage daughters. Pam's going to talk for a few minutes with you. I want to brag on her for a second. First of all, she's written more than 200 page one stories in the New York Times. She started delivering Newsday. That was her beginning in the newspaper game. She was on the local staff of the Times as the Queens bureau chief. She was sent to Oklahoma City to cover the Oklahoma City bombing, and then was put on the national staff and was given a great job in the Midwest of covering, from Chicago, being the bureau chief covering the Midwest. Then we went to Boston. She covered New England, so she had 10 years or more on the national staff as a bureau chief, and now we've consolidated back in the New York area. She's on the science and health staff. She really has had a remarkable career of 20 years at the Times. And she's the author of a very funny and wise book called Island Practice, which I'm going to make her tell you a little bit about before we're done. So I'll plug in her slides, and Pam, would you come up?
Okay. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Mm-hmm. Well, Bill neglected to tell you one detail about what happened when we met. After that first encounter at the prison, the Atlanta paper assigned 6 reporters to shifts round the clock, so that we would always have somebody down there at the prison. And because I was called down because I had this experience covering some turbulent situations as a foreign correspondent, but I was brand new to the paper and I was working in a little suburban bureau, and I was clearly the peon, and so I got the worst shift, which was 3 a.m. to 11 a.m. And Bill was the investigative star at the paper, and he got the best shift. But all of a sudden, he ends up being on my shift. And it turned out that he had asked to switch to my shift, but I didn't find this out until much, much later. And I was really completely clueless about this underlying, ulterior motive for many weeks. So I learned a lot of journalistic lessons from this experience. One, always question people's intentions, and when something looks unusual, it probably is, and you should look into it a little bit more closely. All right, so as Bill said, I've written a lot of different types of stories, and I've learned a lot from every single one of them. But basically, I think that what it comes down to is every story you do is an opportunity to improve your reporting, to improve your writing, and to try to make a difference in people's lives. And I feel that very strongly in what I do now as a health and science writer. People really care about the subjects that we write about, and I consider it a big responsibility and a great privilege. And it's also a hell of a lot of fun. So I'm going to talk to you about some stories, some big, some small, just to give you a sense of some of the range of stuff we do and some of the things that I've learned along the way. So now I'm going to, how do I do this, Bill?
Just go down there.
No, there's a thing.
Oh, wait, okay.
There's a lock.
Okay, just escape. Yeah.
Escape. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah? Okay, down it. Bill is also the tech guy in the house, always solving my tech problems. Okay, and down arrow, da-da-da. So now, so I'm pandering with the cute cat photos, so you can, so this is Holly the cat, and she was taken by her family on vacation to the Daytona Speedway in a motorhome for a huge RV rally. And it's hard to believe in that kind of idyllic circumstance, but she got spooked and she ran away and she was gone. She vanished for 2 months and nobody saw her. And then 2 months later, she just happened to show up 200 miles north back at their home in West Palm Beach. So I, as the science writer, was asked to write a story about the science of how that could happen. And I believe, and I know Bill also believes, in sort of writing not only what you know, but also telling readers what isn't known yet. And in science, everything is a work in progress. So basically my story said scientists had no idea. It could be, magnetic fields, or it could be sound or smell. People didn't know at all. But after the story ran, I heard from someone calling herself a cat communicator, who said that all I really needed to do was interview Holly, and she would tell me. So clearly I had fallen down on my reporting duties, and I learned that lesson. But I did get to slip in some literary references into a paragraph that ended up sparking this kind of little literature geek fan following online. So I'm going to read you this paragraph with apologies to Carl Sandburg and Truman Capote. This is the graph I wrote. I wrote, "One glimpse through the factual fog comes on the little cat's feet. While scientists speculated Holly might have gotten a lift, perhaps sneaking under the hood of a truck heading down I-95, the condition of her paws suggests that she was not driven all the way, nor did Holly go lightly." Okay, so this actually, between us, became one of these adventures in New York Times copy editing, because the copy editor cut that graph, saying that it was too clever. And all my arguments that, Breakfast at Tiffany's had a lost cat in it, it didn't matter, I lost the battle. But then, and our stories are supposed to be the same online as they are in print, so I just figured my little graph was gone. But then I got this email from somebody I didn't know, that said, how could they? How could the New York Times have dropped the line, but Holly couldn't go lightly, from the print version of your lovely story? I was shocked, horrified, and considering dropping my subscription. This is definitely journalistic malfeasance. Someone definitely owes you an apology, but thank you for writing it because some of us got to read it. And then I realized, that's how I realized that it still is in the story online, and people were tweeting about it and commenting on it. So the message there is trust your instincts and argue with the copy editors. Also, in another lesson that I've learned, and I do this often, is don't be afraid to ask seemingly dumb questions. I am always professing my ignorance, which is often substantial, particularly with scientists. And in Atlanta, Bill and I had an example of this that fortunately wasn't our story, but another reporter was writing what was supposed to be this little family-friendly feature about a field trip that a Brownie troop was taking to a science center in Atlanta that's called the Fern Bank, F-E-R-N-B-A-N-K. She was new to Atlanta as well, and she didn't hear right, and she didn't say, really? And the next day she learned her error because the phones lit up with irate parents who were calling to complain because instead of writing the Fern Bank, she had written that the little 7- and 8-year-old Brownie girls were going to the Sperm Bank. So that was my favorite, I think one of my favorite corrections ever. Okay, so I'm a journalist who likes to juggle. And I'm always working on something longer term, something medium term, something breaking, and I actually really like that. Some reporters, probably more like Bill, really like to delve into one thing and only do one thing at a time, and I just actually get a lot of energy from doing many different types of stories. I guess I'm kind of a polygamist journalistically. Marriage-wise, I'm also monogamy. And so I'll give you an example of a kind of a one-night stand in my current job. So that is often scientific studies. And so this was a study that was designed to answer the burning question, do big animals take longer to pee than small animals? So this researchers, they sought to measure what they called urination duration, seriously, in elephants and zebras and lions and pandas and goats and chihuahuas. And the authors, they said that they were trying to learn things that could be applicable to kind of how the human plumbing system works. At least that's what they said. But they described the challenges of trying to capture the pee in these cut-off soda bottles. You can see them kneeling in the back. They said that they tried pans, but the animals thought that was weird for some reason. And it turns out, this is a fact you can use to dazzle your friends at the next cocktail party or whatever, that whether you're an elephant with a 5-gallon bladder or a cat with a bladder that's 3,000 times smaller, you still take about 21 seconds to pee. And they even had some streaming video and animals, they just kind of whiz right by you. Anyway. Sorry, all right. So see, the light stuff is what kind of gets you through the heavy stuff. And I do a lot of the heavy stuff. And so as Howie mentioned, for a number of months last year, I was kind of wedded to the Ebola coverage. And in particular, this investigation into why the outbreak, which had really showed signs of kind of dying down and tapering off in the spring of 2014, why it sort of boomeranged back up into this incredibly devastating outbreak that's killed thousands and is still something that we need to worry about. And so we, through a lot of both on-the-ground reporting and getting confidential documents and emails and memos and things like that, were able to show that a lot of this was about missteps and misjudgments that some of the health authorities had made, that they had gotten too complacent, they thought that they could handle it, they didn't keep good track of sick people who were crisscrossing the borders of these 3 countries, they pulled out of several areas too soon. They didn't really understand the cultural situation that was going on the ground, or how suspicious people were of Western healthcare workers. That project was wonderful in addition to winning the Pulitzer for it. The day, just coincidentally, I think, that the Pulitzer was announced, the World Health Organization came out with some new emergency guidelines for dealing with crises like this, and many of the steps that they recommended were things that we had pointed out in our reporting. So it's very rewarding, but there's still things to do. So when I'm not doing Ebola, many of my stories fall under what I would consider sort of two broad umbrellas. So sort of the area of neurological, cognitive, mental health issues, and the area of reproductive health and hormones and gender science. Basically, we're sort of talking about the brain, we're talking about sex. So I want to talk a little bit about both. I was kind of trying to decide which to do first, so flipped a coin, heads for the brain and tails for sex. So here's a quick brain story. This is sort of an example of a quick thing that I did about a device that just got approved that can help people with some types of blindness get some semblance of vision. And the reason I like to show this slide is because if you look at the front page display here, so the headline says, "Device offers partial vision for the blind," and the picture, for some reason, that we ran next to it is President Obama peering through a magnifying glass. So the print paper is fun sometimes. I'll talk a little bit about this Alzheimer's story, because that was really one of the things that I guess I feel sort of proudest of in this role that I've been in. When I had just gotten to the science section and my editor said, what would you like to write about? And I said, well, how about Alzheimer's? And she said, and this is a good example of really the threshold that we have to cross in order when we decide what stories to write about. She said, well, I don't know if there's anything really new to say about Alzheimer's, because we've been writing for years that all these drugs that people have been trying on people who have symptoms have just failed to do very much. But she said, you can poke around. So that's sort of famous last words for me. So I poked around and unearthed some reference to this large family in Colombia, which turned out to be the largest family to suffer from Alzheimer's. They have this early onset Alzheimer's that's caused by a single genetic mutation. So if you've got the mutation, you're going to get it. And nobody had really written about that. So I convinced my editor to send me and a photographer, Todd Heisler, to Colombia. Took a lot of planning. There were a few security precautions we had to take. There was one village we went to where there was some drug and guerrilla violence, and they said they had never seen a gringo there before. There were. But we concluded, and this is one of the families, these are 2 of 4 siblings in the same family who have Alzheimer's. The one who's in bed is about 60 and is really very, very far advanced, and the one who's pointing his finger is in his late 40s and is just getting symptoms, but he was in denial there. So he was being given a memory test and he kept messing it up, but he wasn't acknowledging that he was having problems. So it was very sad. But what we found was that this wasn't just a very sad story. It was about a family, dealing with this horrendous disease, but it was also a really potentially groundbreaking science, because there were Colombian and American scientists who were studying them and saying, we think we can look at this family and work with them as a way to see if we can change the way we deal with Alzheimer's and see if we can prevent it by giving people perhaps a treatment years before they're going to develop symptoms. So we did a big package of stories on this. Partly as a result of that, this project got a grant, one of the first federal grants from the first National Alzheimer's Project. The drug trials started, and it'll be done in a few years. And it's really kind of changed the face of Alzheimer's research now. Everybody is talking about prevention. So it's been really very exciting. Okay. Because I just thought maybe, so that led to a series. My editor was now convinced. I went to South Korea. I did an Alzheimer's story. I went to California and spent some time in a men's prison where they have trained first-degree murderers to take care of other first-degree murderers with dementia, because there's a lot of people getting old in prison and they're getting dementia and nobody can afford to hire caregivers for them, so that was very interesting. So that's become sort of a specialized area for me. All right, so now, talk about sex. Do you have time to talk about sex? Okay.
Ask the students, they might be interested. You guys interested in sex? I guess, I don't know if they're interested.
Are they not interested?
Well, what do you think, huh?
What do you think, guys?
Sex or Mets?
All right. Well, so when I talk about sex, I mean, there's two things, right? So I do a lot of reproductive health work, and that's obviously a very sensitive area, in particular dealing with abortion. And so I work very hard, actually with everything, but it's especially cognizant of it in this kind of area, to be very fair and respectful to all sides. And basically my theory is, let every team play its best, put its best pitcher on the field. I mean, just let everybody make their best case. I don't have a dog in the fight. I want the most knowledgeable person on all sides, not just the person who's going to give the quick soundbite. And I want to ask skeptical questions of everyone. So an example of that was I did a story. I wanted to write about these pregnancy centers, which are centers that are set up by, basically they're sort of set up to try to persuade young women not to abort. So they're kind of like the softer side of the anti-abortion movement, and they rarely, if ever, let reporters in. It took me a very long time, a lot of slammed phones, but I finally got a place in Waco, Texas to let me in. And there's no substitute really, for being on the ground when you're reporting. Just observing, just seeing what they're doing. And what I turned up with was something that I think was really instructive for all sides, because these centers, they're very nurturing, they're very supportive. They even have, this one in Waco even has a house where they'll let young women stay if they're, if they need support away from their family. They'll help them pay their bills. But they're also very strategic. For example, they focus grouped the paint colors that they painted on their walls. They went to a local college and they asked young women what their favorite colors were, and they came up with eggplant and turquoise, and that's what the colors are. And they advertise outside the abortion clinic, and they offer to pay for your ultrasound if you change your mind. And they also give some misinformation in terms of medical consequences. For example, saying that abortion can lead to breast cancer. So one thing that I learned was that the head of this organization, CareNet, that ran this particular pregnancy center, used to work at Pepsi. And so I asked him, is there anything in common? And in fact, he said, yes. In fact, the strategy is pretty similar. He said at Pepsi, the end result was to put liquid into someone's stomach. We talked about it as share of stomach. And the work that the centers are doing is really a lot around share of mind. So just that quote is very revealing, obviously, right? But then I went to Planned Parenthood in Waco and found that they really weren't able to counteract some of these nurturing messages, because they were very clinical, linoleum floors, no comfy couches. And when I asked them what they would do with women who were confused, because of course a lot of women are going to be confused, they said, well, we're our patient's medical provider, we're not their emotional support. And so both sides read that story and had criticisms and had praise for it. They all saw things in there that was revealing about themselves and the other side. So that's what I felt like, where I feel like I'm doing my job. well. And I'll just end with a couple of very quick sex things, which are a bit more fun. It's hard to write about sex for the New York Times sometimes, because they don't like to use a lot of the explicit vocabulary. But sometimes I found that it depends on where the story runs. So, for example, in a story that I wrote about male contraceptives, the effort to develop like a male pill or an implant or something. This was an initial draft edited by the science editors. I quoted a scientist saying that this drug that blocks sperm production was being tested, quote, on rabbits trained to ejaculate into a fake vagina. Now this sailed through the science editors. They're like, yeah, of course, you know. But when the story was chosen to run on the Sunday front page, those editors decided it didn't pass. Apparently we have this crucial Sunday brunch test, you know, if it's going to make you spit out your mimosa or something like that, you know. So what ultimately ran said only that the drug was being tested on rabbits. Now you know. I mean, it's a lot more vivid the other way. But fortunately, the science section doesn't think that way. So by contrast, in a story that I did on preventing HIV infections in Africa by circumcising adult men, I was allowed, and this was for a special issue of the Science Times called Small Fixes, which was fun. I got to use this quote. We're hacking away at it every month. Those foreskins are flying. And we got no complaining letters. We got one person suggested that Flying Foreskins would be a good name for a band, so I play in a jazz group and I was thinking of suggesting. All right, it's always good to have sex. And on that note, here's my husband.
I want to focus just on two approaches or lessons I think I've learned, and they have to do with noticing or finding stories, and on the choices that we make in how to tell them, the format perhaps of how to tell stories. First, the noticing. I've been doing this for 30-some years, and I have to admit I don't feel like I'm a particularly good noticer. I was working at the Chicago Sun-Times. I would catch the bus to go to work and get my coffee every day at a McDonald's. And one day that McDonald's had a sign that said, "Oh, we're closing." And then I'm catching the bus a week or two later, and there's a sign that said, "Coming soon, McDonald's." And during the next 6 weeks, they tore down this McDonald's, and I noticed that I had to get my coffee somewhere else, and then they built a McDonald's. And it did not occur to me at any point going to the newspaper, why would you tear down a McDonald's to build a McDonald's? Why would you do that? And I got the answer when I picked up another Chicago newspaper, the Tribune, and McDonald's is big business in Chicago. It's headquartered there. They have a beat reporter for McDonald's. And it turned out that McDonald's was trying to make its hamburgers more like Burger King, make it your way, have it your way. Make them when you order them, not make them ahead of time. And that meant reconfiguring the kitchens. And then in many cases they decided, it said in this article, that they just needed to tear the building down and build a new one. And that was one of many occasions when I had that feeling, oh, I could have had that. If I'd been more awake. I did notice they were tearing down the McDonald's, but I didn't ask why. And so I think I've learned a little bit from those experiences through the years. I'm not a better noticer, I don't suspect. But I asked that. And I want to tell you about a story that happened just because of that, how he referred to it. I was working for NBC News on its website, which used to be called MSNBC.com and then became NBCnews.com. We weren't TV people. We were really print people working online and working with TV people. And I was doing investigative stories, and some of them for television, some for online. And we were also trying to buy a house. we had just moved. Pam's tenure in Boston had ended, and we had moved down to Connecticut, and we were shopping for a house. And the market had fallen, and we were trapped. This was 2008, 2009. We couldn't get rid of the house in Boston. We were trapped as landlords, and we didn't have the money to buy where we were. But I was looking at the listings, and out of frustration, I started looking at the houses we really couldn't afford. The ones at the top of the list, the most expensive houses for sale in Connecticut. And the top house for sale in Connecticut was a bargain. It had been marked down from $35 million to $24 million in New Canaan. 52 acres and a river with a 14,000 square foot French mansion, that's it, in the most expensive community in the state. I was guessing the chairman of GE, which is nearby, probably lived there. So I went online to the town website, looked up in the assessor's records the address. And I didn't recognize this name at all, or even know how to say it. Huguette Clark, I didn't know the name. But I did search the website one more time before I left there for the address. And there was a little zoning board here. I'm a public records reporter. And there was a little, the minutes of a zoning hearing where her lawyer said to the town, oh, as you know, he said, this home has been unoccupied since this owner bought it. But it said in the listing, or Zillow, it said that this owner had bought it in 1951. And I thought, well, that seems odd. How could a home be vacant, unlived in, for nearly 60 years? Now, at that point, what do I have in this story? 3 minutes, maybe? So the next morning, I drove over to New Canaan to see it. There's a little serpentine brick wall. It's faded. There's no buzzer. There's no bell. I reached over the wall and knocked on the window and the air conditioner of this little caretaker cabin across the wall. And a little old man in his t-shirt came wandering out. He was in his mid-80s, and he came out and he said, yes, this is Mrs. Clark's house, and she is a wonderful employer. I've been here 20 years, and I've not ever met her. He just got paid by her attorney who sent a check every month. He said the house was empty. He said it had been empty before when his predecessors were there, and then they retired, and he's been there 20 years. There was no furniture. He said the Jaguar in the garage was his. So I think I'd gotten from him what there was to get, and I was leaving, and he said, can I ask you a question? He said, do you suppose she's been dead all these years? Well, I didn't know, but I was now interested to find out. So what do I have? I have an hour in the story at this point. I go home and I'm online, and I find that this is not her nicest empty house. She has another house in California, 20,000 square feet on 23 acres overlooking the Pacific in Santa Barbara. And the legend online was that the house was furnished and well kept and ready for the Clarks anytime they should arrive, and none had been there since about 1951. And I didn't really believe that the table was set for dinner every night. But something was going on. And then I found it in public records that she had another place. She had 3 apartments on 5th Avenue in New York City. 3 separate apartments in the same building, a total of 15,000 square feet. We're now up to like as much room as is in the White House. And so I went down to the doorman, told me, he said, no, that's Mrs. Clark. Yes, she has all the 8th floor and half the 12th, but we've not seen her in at least 20 years. Right. So I started collecting photos about the family of this woman, Huguette Clark's famous father, who had founded Las Vegas, who had been the 2nd richest man in America in the early 1900s from copper mining, who had been tossed out of the United States Senate on a bribery case. And I was a little surprised that this Huguette Clark could even be alive. She was born in 1906. Think about it. Her father was 22 years old when the Civil War began. He was born in the the Van Buren administration, our 8th president. She was born in the Roosevelt administration, and here she was still alive in the Obama administration. But where was she? Well, it turned out that she had lived at a hospital in New York City for the last 20 years. She died the next year after I started looking into this. She died at age 104, 2 weeks short of her 105th birthday. And she'd been in the hospital for 7,400 nights at that point. Perfectly healthy, but preferring to live in the hospital. All right. So I called my editor, and I said, I don't think this is what you're paying me to do, but let me tell you about this house. I was supposed to be doing serious stories. I'd written about abuse of detainees at Guantanamo and the police officers at Guantanamo who had tried to stop the CIA interrogations. I'd written about firefighters who died because their safety equipment failed. It worked, except when it got hot or wet. And after they'd known about these problems, 12 firefighters had died. That's what I was supposed to be doing. But my editor, bless him, said, well, I would read that. You should find her. You should find out what's going on with this. So, I won't try to summarize it all, but what we had was a story that began, oddly, as a slideshow. A very strange choice for an investigative reporter to make. I was collecting these pictures from historical societies and old newspapers, and I showed them to our daughters, and I showed them to my mother, and I was explaining, oh, that's the one on the left, and that's their house in Central Park, and I was, it was the largest house ever in New York City, 121 rooms for a family of 4. And at a projects meeting online, I've got the pictures running so our projects team can look at them, a photographer says to me, well, you'll never get all these pictures on the story online. The page will never load if you put 40 pictures on it. Why don't you just tell it as a slideshow? And I said, oh yeah, we'll make a slideshow. He said, no, no, no. What I'm saying is don't write a story. Just write a slideshow with captions. And so that's what we did. It was 2,800 words, 47 photos, 80 million page views, average time 12 minutes on the story. And people were interested. And at that point, we didn't even still know where she was. We hadn't gotten to the hospital. There's a certain flexibility, I think, that's really required in how you choose how to tell your stories. Some stories are best in a timeline. Some are best in an interactive graphic, or a video, or a traditional TV-style story, or a narrative, or a straight news story. Some work better in a series where you store it all up, and then do it in 3 parts. And some work much better in an occasional series, because every time you write something, people read it and start tipping you to more things. And this was a story that had a lot more coming. If you've ever been to a Seder, you know the Jewish word dayenu, that would have been enough for us. Well, before we were done, we not only had the woman in the hospital for 20 years, we had a criminal investigation of her finances. Her accountant was a felon. There were no 15-year-old girls on Long Island who wanted to date 61-year-old accountants. But there were police officers in Nassau County posing as 15-year-old girls, and the accountant had met them on AOL. And there was the nurse who received $31 million in gifts. Diana. I want to emphasize one more point about the idea of noticing stories. For those of you who do journalism or some kind of reporting or writing, I want to encourage you to think about where you're sitting and where you could sit differently while you're working on those stories. A different place you could sit that would change your perspective and increase your chances of noticing a story. Where do you sit at a graduation if you're forced to cover it? No one's favorite assignment. Where would you sit? Maybe find the most interesting person to sit with. Maybe find the parents with the student with the loan debt. Maybe find the oldest graduate. Find somebody interesting to sit with, but certainly don't sit where they tell you the press is supposed to sit. There are no stories in the press box. I had a fun couple of summers covering Sammy Sosa and the home run chase back in the 90s at Wrigley Field for the New York Times. And I just want to describe a couple of efforts to change the perspective and how that worked out. I sat with Dominican fans who were rooting for Sosa. They're waving the Dominican flag, and I spent half a game with them. I sat with the men in the back row of the bleachers who bet on everything and who were trying to help the ball hawk down on Sheffield Avenue, the guy on the street who's catching home runs and foul balls, and they tap their left shoulder when the left-handed batter comes up so he will know to move over and play it off the taxi. There was a young man who was a rookie who was pitching for the first time in the major leagues, and I sat for a couple of innings with his father in the stands. The father had spent the night on the hotel room floor, had just come into town to watch his son, who he played catch with in the yard all those years, and now his son's going to be a major league pitcher. And he's got no sleep for about 36 hours, but I just sat for a couple of innings with him to try to capture some of that feeling. Okay, well, I had exhausted the ballpark, so I'm out in the family section in the left field bleachers. There's no beer allowed in the family section. I'm standing out there, and there's a fellow, you know, we're 350 feet from home plate. It's an afternoon game. He's a business person. He's wearing his suit, and he's right-handed. He's got a glove on his left hand. He's standing there with his glove on. He would have to hit the ball and then pick it up and hit it again to get it to him, and he is standing there with his glove. And I said, why the glove? And he said, well, you know, I'm hoping to catch the $1 million home run ball, the record-setting home run ball. I said, well, what would you do with it? And he said, well, I was going to give it back to Sosa or McGuire when they set the record. But my accountant told me that I would owe the gift tax, and that would be about $180,000, and I can't afford that. And I said, what, gift? I don't know about gift tax. What? And he explained to me that the ball, when it's hit, is worth about $9, but when he catches it, it's worth about $1 million, and that if you give somebody a gift, you, the giver of the gift, owe the tax on that gift. He had talked to his accountant about this. So I called Phil, who did our taxes, and Phil said, yep, that's definitely the rule. So I called the desk at the New York Times, and they said, that doesn't sound right to us. If you get a professor to say it, we'll write this, we'll publish the story. So I got a professor. The next day, the team was traveling to Pittsburgh. I found a law professor in Pittsburgh and sat down with him, and he said, that's definitely the rule. There's no doubt. And so then I called the desk, and they said, well, professors are not really experts. If you can get the IRS to say it, then we'll. So I called the IRS, and they said, yes, definitely, that's the rule. There's no doubt. So that was a page one story. You know, fan who catches the home run ball faces a tax bite. And then they were all yelling about it in Congress the next day, and the IRS backed down. They said, well, we were right. I mean, technically that's true. But, you know, some 12-year-old kid who catches the ball, we're not really going to go after him. And we're not un-American. And we didn't understand the infield fly rule either, they said. I don't think that was any great story. And obviously, I missed the key story of that whole summer, which was the steroids in the locker of Mark McGuire. It was an AP reporter who noticed a bottle. Partly what I like about that story was that it was there for any of us to get. I think a lot of us think of investigative reporting from the sort of Watergate, Bob Woodward in the parking garage talking to a mysterious character. But most investigative stories come to us because we notice something and we pull on that string. We say, well, what's up with that? I don't understand that. Explain that to me. And I don't think that we are particularly good at being noticers, but what I think you can be more practiced at is responding to just that little something in your peripheral vision. Say, what was that again? Tell me what was that. Explain that to me. Pam and I have got a couple of questions we're going to ask each other, and then we're going to take your questions. Howard.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt. Can you hear me? Because I changed my mic, so perhaps a little better. So the tradition usually is that when our guests come, they sit down and one of the faculty kind of interview them. I won't say grill them. So it would be me.
Marveled at is how Pam is able to do stories with the very emotional, people at the worst days of their lives, people in very emotional situations. You wrote about, in Island Practice, there's a chapter about a rash of suicides on Nantucket. And your protagonist is on the school committee, and his wife is at the school, and so this is part of the story. And nobody wanted you to write about the suicides, and you're dealing with parents who were very protective about what details would get in there from their lost teenagers. You did a series last year about maternal mental health issues featuring a couple of horrible cases of mothers who had committed suicide, including one who took the baby in arms and jumped off a building in Manhattan. The child survived. So you're dealing there with upset family, widower, sister. You have editors who want you to get the suicide note. So you have your reporter's imperatives to get the detail. You have the reader in mind to tell them the full story, but you're dealing with these people with this most vulnerable situation. How do you do that? And then at the end, they don't hate you.
Well, I guess, it doesn't seem like it's any magical formula to me. I just really try to be very straightforward with people, and I try to, I approach them with respect, and I'm interested. I'm genuinely interested in what's going on with them. And I think somehow that comes through. I will, when I'm trying to get people who are in sensitive situations to talk with me, I'll do a number of different things. I will let them ask me questions. Before you commit to anything, ask me whatever you want about what I'm going to be doing. And let me know if there are things that you're uncomfortable with, and we can talk about those. Because often what happens is people may be okay and even see the value of conveying their story to an audience because it might help others in their situation, because it might even be cathartic for them, because it might be valuable in some other way. But they're very protective about certain details that they don't want in. And if you just spend some time with them and listen to them, they may say, I'm okay about this, but I just don't want you to say that my brother has epilepsy because that's a family secret, and that's fine. I don't need to do that. Or I don't want you to say where I work or the exact town that I live in, but you can say the rest of this. So that's part of what I do to begin with.
And you do a lot of conversations.
I do a lot of conversations.
You're on the phone with these people. It's not like a one hit and run 20-minute kind of thing.
No. And I always encourage them to call me back, to email me if they have questions, other things that they want to think about, things that they want to add. And that's with Island Practice, which is largely a funny book, I have to say. It does have this one very dark chapter about this sort of spate of teenage suicides that was very, very difficult to write about. And I took a lot of time. I knew that I actually had started working on the book at the time the suicides were happening. And part of this is also timing. But I deliberately did not ask any of the families, or try to talk to any of them for probably 2 or 3 years at least 2 years after that episode had ended. Because I didn't need to talk to them right then, and I felt like they needed some time. And then I sort of very gingerly, through introductions, through other people who had come to know me and feel comfortable with me, had them ask these families if they wanted to talk with me, and some did, some didn't. And then we just had a lot of discussions about what would be used and how it would be used, and some things you can negotiate and some things you have to be firm about, but it turned out that the people on the island, Island Practice is a book about this very unconventional doctor who's basically the go-to doctor on Nantucket for this year-round community that's very interesting and quirky and diverse. And one of his hats, one of his many hats, is that he's the medical examiner, and he tried to save all these kids and also pronounce them dead, and also on the school committee. So he had a lot to do with he knew all these families personally, so it was very, very difficult for him. But the island itself was kind of anticipating that book and that chapter with some degree of dread, I think. And when it came out, they were so the people who were working in suicide prevention were so appreciative that they actually, in the bookstores, they actually distributed with a suicide prevention pamphlet because they felt like it finally got their story out, got the island right. And so if you take the time and are respectful to people, I think you often have those kinds of results.
And you build a track record which you can then tell them about and say, I deal with this all the time.
Right. That's true. All right. You call yourself a reporter.
Yes.
I'm reading this. You call yourself a reporter, not a writer. And you feel like there are conflicts between narrative writing and good reporting and nonfiction journalism. And so tell me about those conflicts.
Well, I think that it's a conflict. What happens is that in choosing to tell stories, in choosing to do narrative writing, a lot of journalists, I think, sacrifice being true to the facts. In research for our book, which ended up being called Empty Mansions, I wrote with one of Yvette Clarke's cousins, and he's not a journalist, he's not an author, he's a real estate guy. And though every time we would disagree on a paragraph, he would mention that he was the editor of his college paper. I said, yeah, I know, 63 times. But the two of us are writing this, it's our first book. And in our research, we kept running across books that are in the libraries that are called nonfiction books, but had made-up material. They would have a page of a dialogue between two characters. And there'd be a footnote. You follow that footnote, and there might be a street address in there of the house they lived in, but where did that dialogue come from? We've looked at all the sources. It clearly was made up. Or there would be thoughts put into the heads of the characters. Her world turned on its axis when she saw that the Japanese, her friends, had attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Well, you have to ask yourself, how does the writer know this? The writer can't know this. We know what people do and say and write sometimes. But we never know what people believe or feel or think. If you listen to NPR, every time someone's quoted, there's a soundbite, they introduce it by saying, so-and-so believes, which is exactly what a reporter from NPR couldn't possibly know. Said. There's nothing wrong with said. It's a fine word. That's what's verifiable. We know that someone says things. We don't know what they do. Even in Washington, sometimes people say one thing and believe something else. They have one reason and they give another. There was a New York Times cover piece this past weekend in the magazine about what do we really know about who killed bin Laden. And one of a really fine reporter and writer, Mark Bowden, was taken to task in there because in his book about the death of bin Laden, he describes in great detail these photographs of the burial at sea. Whether or not there was a burial at sea is at issue. Well, he's describing them in great detail, and Cy Hirsch, the investigative reporter, called Mark to say, did you see those? Do you have the photographs? Did you see these photos? And he said, no. An official at the White House had described them for me. And my feeling about that is it really that awkward? Does it really get in the way of your narrative that much to slip in, according to an official who saw the photos? Well, that's not true either. According to an official who said he saw the photos. That's verifiable. And is it really going to interrupt? It's no longer a narrative book if you tell people what you know. if you, just one more thing about this, if you think about it, information's on a spectrum. There's stuff you absolutely know when you're writing a story. You saw it happen. You saw the document. Then there are things where you've got one side of it and there's no other side. Nobody's talking. Nobody else is talking. This is your only information. You can't confirm it. Then there are things that are in dispute. People give two different or slightly different or contradictory stories. And then there are things you don't know about at all. I trust stories that tell me what they don't know. I want to be able to get to the end of the story as a reader and be able to tell where the information is in that story on that spectrum. How do they know what they know? Where are they missing confirmation? Where is their contradictory information? And maybe what are the facts that might lead me to believe this person more than that person? Now I trust that story because the reporter is treating me like I'm a smart reader. And I would encourage you to treat your readers like they're smart. They are. And tell them what you know and how you know it. And tell them what you don't know. And one of the hardest things, I think, for me, it was for as a young journalist, it may be for all young journalists to get, is that your credibility goes up when you say what you don't know. You would think bluster and I know it will help you, but no, it doesn't help at all. Exclamation points do not help. You have a lifetime supply, 20 exclamation points. Don't use them all up at once. Saying what you don't know, what someone wouldn't tell you, what questions they wouldn't answer, what they wouldn't explain, really helps the credibility of our journalism, I think.
So I'm just going to ask you one question. If you would like to ask a question, come to this mic, okay? I hope you have some good questions. So one question.
Far away.
The best and worst thing about being married to a journalist. You're first, okay? Best and worst thing, married to another journalist.
Well,
careful.
The best is, it's notable that Pam was a national correspondent for the New York Times and had 2 children during that period. And that hasn't happened much, that someone's just, you know, February 20th of 2003, there was a horrible event called the Station Fire in Rhode Island. 100 people died in the nightclub fire. And February 20th, 2003 was also Pam's due date for our second daughter. And that morning we woke up to the news of the horrible fire. Pam's now 1 day past her due date, and she got in the car and drove down to Rhode Island and covered the fire and had a story on the front page and delayed the birth until the 23rd.
This is true. I was off. I was not supposed to be working because I was working till my due date. But I called the desk and I said, "I'm going down there." And they said, "You should go." I was like, "No. It's a big story in my region. I'm going." And I got there, and the one thing that I did was that the cops had blocked off all the access roads to the area that I went, except for residents. And I drove up to the police officer and I said, "I'm 9 months and a day pregnant." And he said, "Where's your doctor?" But he let me through, so I didn't have to waddle quite so far to the scene. But then I did, and I have to say it was there's a lot of things I remember, obviously, about that time, but covering such a devastating loss of life when you are carrying another life within you that's about to be born is a very difficult kind of thing. It was very wrong.
And to dealing with your question, I want to say that it's often neglected, this idea that she excelled through these years as a woman doing this job, and as a mother with a job that required so much travel. I was talking to editors at the Boston Globe about this. I said something about this, and one of the editors said, well, that's not unusual. We've had several parents who've been national correspondents. There was Bob and George and Ron and Sam. And another editor, a woman, said, "You idiot, those are all men. Those are fathers, those are not mothers." And it really does make a difference.
So I'm just going to ask you, because you really didn't, in all due respect, answer the question.
It happens.
It was a great story. It was great. Best and worst thing about being married to another journalist. Go ahead. One more shot, and then we'll throw it over to questions.
She won't answer the question either, I hope.
What? What's good about it? Is it hard for both of you to be on this kind of work schedule with your kids? Do you have any rivalry? Do you help each other on stories? Do you understand each other's work so you get it? I mean, is that helpful? Yeah.
Oh, well, I think it's very helpful because we understand each other's work, and because we understand each other's crazy schedules. And I have to say that for me, you know, again, maybe there's some imbalance where, but I feel very fortunate as a woman to have a husband who completely gets it. I have to stay late. I have to go someplace. I have to, you know, I'm going to Ireland. I'm going to California. And, you know, he's going to Minnesota. We both really have been, I think, unfailingly supportive of each other's work.
And we did help reading each other's book. I copy edited her book.
Right, so do you want to add anything before we start?
Yeah.
Okay, so the message here is that you should find another journalist to marry, okay? All of you should be looking for mates in the journalist.
Nobody but journalists will have it.
Yes, that's true. Also, there's no ethical conflict because you can't. It's not like you're interviewing a lot of. You know, who are you? That was the answer I would have given a few years ago was, who else am I going to meet? Because it's either people I'm covering or it's people. And if they're people I'm covering, I can't go out with them. So.
All right, questions. Go. Introduce yourself first, okay?
All right. Well, firstly, thank you very much for being here. My name is Justine. I'm a sophomore in journalism. My question for you, too, is in what ways have you changed, grown as journalists from the start of your careers to now, since you've had very long and successful careers, and how has being married to each other had influence on that?
I get to take this.
Let's do these rapid fire.
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll try to keep it a small answer, but I learned a tremendous amount from Bill from the very beginning, because I was a kind of public leader, and so just little things and big strategy things. It's been a very both supportive and really a learning process for me. And in terms of how I've changed, I feel like as a journalist, it's still a work in progress, but I feel like I'm hopefully, just better at my craft all around, I hope, with each story. Really with each story, I sort of learn a little bit more about writing, a little bit more about reporting, and I feel a little bit more confident taking risks. And trying new things. So maybe that's the best way to answer that.
If I think of what's different now from when we started, the main difference is social media and email connectivity to the readers. And I try really hard to get ideas from readers. The best if you Google investigative reporter, you'll see basically me saying, send me documents, send me stories. And some of the best stories come in that way. You get, I get 10 or 12 junk emails a day that aren't helpful, but some of the best things that have come, that I've worked on have been from that. And so that connection, encouraging that connection to readers, being very explicit about it. If you know more about this story, please send us, has really, I think, has been the biggest change in what we've adapted to and what we've learned in how to do our work, is interacting with the readers, as opposed to the old style of you just wrote the story, and then if they had a quarter or 50 cents or $1, they could buy it. That's been the biggest thing that we've learned, is how to try to get more out of that relationship. So, for example, it means collecting anecdotes when you're asking for them and collecting them before you run the story, so that they can be online when the story runs. Yeah. It means having to watch social media so that you can rebuttals to your stories. So that you can fight back when people are trying to overturn your story. I think that's the biggest thing that's changed.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. My name is David Mayer. I'm a journalism student. You're both obviously very talented and accomplished reporters. My question is what skill do you see in the other that you wish you possessed? That's to both of you.
You get to take that one.
Well, she has the empathy of getting through those difficult stories and getting people to the end when they're all still happy, right? if I'm writing about you, and as much as I might want to appear as though it really makes me sad to be writing this terrible thing about this, I have trouble not letting it show through that I really am enjoying doing the story. I think that's the big difference.
Well, one thing that I've always, I think, admired about Bill is that he has this sense of confidence that whatever he is working on at the moment is the most important thing to be working on, and it's going to be great. And and I have a lot more second guessing of myself, and a lot more, somewhere in the middle of a project, I'll be like, oh, this is, why am I doing this again? Or, I have to kind of talk myself back into, find ways to get myself kind of re-interested in something. Although the book was the only one, I was telling Hallie, it was the only one where I didn't have that problem. I was just constantly interested in everything. Things just kept happening, so it was fascinating. But for most things, I have a period of sort of self-doubt about whether this is worth the best investment of my time, and am I doing this the right way? And I almost never see that with Bill, so it's a
facade. But that confidence is helpful because, for example, you have to keep editors confident that the story's going to be good. You have to keep, because they're giving you time and money, you have to keep them confident that they can promote it, that put it on the front or whatever.
And actually, that's true. Like, I remember we had a discussion about this, and I was telling him that that's what I felt, and he said, yeah, but I do that because it not only keeps the editors interested, but it also is contagious for him. In other words, when he projects a certain sense of confidence about it, he would lose it.
Well, part of it is that I like to stay away from the pack. If there's an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm just guessing it's going to have enough reporters covering it. And so I'm not interested in the oil spill. Because I know it'll get covered, I'm wondering what isn't getting. And I'm trying to write about things that wouldn't get covered unless I did them. So otherwise, I have trouble quite seeing the point of the exercise. So that means that you're often doing something which probably doesn't feel very important. Now, you hope that when you're done, people will say, wow, I'm glad we did that. But at the time, it's not in the news every day. And so it may feel unimportant or just an auxiliary thing.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Jill Ryan. I'm a freshman journalism major. And I was wondering if either of you have ever investigated a story or thought there was a story there, but it ended up amounting to nothing. And how did you deal with that or move on?
Well, I'll just give you the sort of stock investigative reporters and editors panel answer to that, which I think is right. Which is that what you don't do is go, oh, I spent 3 months on this and I got nothing, because you and your editor should be constantly checking. What do we have? How good is it going to be? And is it worth the time and money that we're putting into it? And you're always trying to keep what we call a high minimum. It's not a fishing expedition. If you get nothing else other than what we're sure we'll have, that will be a story. Now, maybe it gets a whole lot more interesting than that, but we're sure we at least have enough. We're thinking in terms of what the floor is. And if you keep that in mind, part of it is selling your editor. Editor management is an important part of this, where you get excited about something and take them what you found so that they stay excited, and we'll let you go work on some more. But you don't want to be out there on a fishing expedition. The whole idea is to keep checking. If I get nothing more, what do I have? It's really the same checking that you do on a daily story. You have in your head, you get used to after enough time, not so long time. You get used to this, I got to be done by 4 o'clock, I've got to get this call returned, and I have to get this document, and I've got to check these facts, and I've got to write the thing. You're trying to get it all together by whatever your deadline is. And it's the same process. It's just an investigative report, it can be extended over days or weeks or months or years.
So would there be an incubated period of time where you could use to find a story like would,
That has to be why, mostly that's why you're working on another story. What we would, as an editor, what you would expect your reporters to be doing, let's say reporters are covering beats. You want your reporters writing enterprise memos or having a list of story ideas that they think would be worthy of extra effort. And maybe that's just enough extra effort to have it be a centerpiece on Sunday or Monday or something they work for 4 days on. Or maybe it's a longer thing, and then maybe they want to team up with someone. But they can be gathering string on that. Those editors have learned to push reporters to provide ideas that are not topics. Endangered species. Well, that's not a story idea. That's not a project proposal. That's just a Wikipedia entry. That's just a topic. And so what you need is to be able to answer the questions, what are you going to report? What are you going to find out? How are we going to find it out? How are we going to tell it? How will you illustrate it? What video? What photos? What documents? What's extra on the web? You ought to be able to fill out that card or application, grant application, to get a project green-lighted to get the 2 weeks. So no one's ever in journalism handing you, here's 2 weeks or 6 weeks to go work on something and see if you can turn it into a bona fide idea. That's never going to happen. But you have to do that to then buy the next bit of time.
But I think you also have to be willing to walk away from a story or from part of a story if the reporting doesn't bear out. I have had to do that a number of times. I mean, on pieces of stories like this maternal mental illness story, the series that I did last year. I spent a lot of time finding women who had suffered from very severe maternal mental illness, either psychosis or very severe depression, and who were willing to talk about it. And there was one woman who I reached through some channels, and she had actually been accused of hurting her baby. And I was speaking with her, and she was claiming that it was postpartum psychosis, and it would have been a great story. But I checked it out. Like, you got to check it out. I talked to, I looked at I pulled all the court records. It was in Hawaii. I wish I could have gone to Hawaii, but I couldn't make that case. But I pulled all the court records. I talked to her therapist. I just didn't get a good enough feeling that in fact she had done this act to her child because she had mental illness. I think she just harmed him. And so I walked away from it. And I think of that like sort of in the context of the Rolling Stone case, for example. They didn't do their due diligence. And at some point, they either should have done all the work or walked away. And so you just have to be willing to say, I told my editor about it, and I said, that case, I don't think it's going to pan out. I don't feel comfortable about it.
We only have about 5 minutes to 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask the 4 people. I'm going to try to get at all your questions, okay? So we're going to try to get into questions in that kind of a...
Sorry.
You want one omnibus answer to the 4 questions?
Maybe you each decide who's going to answer.
We'll roll with it.
We have 5 minutes, and I want to get these 4 questions in, and I want to make a comment, and Daniel Murphy has hit another home run, and the Mets are now up 2-1. Name, question, fast response, okay?
Slightly taller than this. Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a sophomore journalism student, and I was wondering if you guys could see validity in an investigative piece about the application of journalistic ethics, mostly pertaining to bias in today's media, and what kind of impact you guys think that could have on the voice or tone or just means of gathering information or portraying information.
We've got to be more specific.
I'm thinking
such as
the political election cycle that's happening right now, and you can see how supposedly accurate news sources are completely skewing facts and making up lies, and how that hasn't, while that's been addressed in sly comments and SNL skits, I don't think anybody's blatantly said, you're lying and you need to stop this.
It's the reporters who are lying.
Yes.
Or the media commentators on cable TV.
Exactly.
Well, my just reaction is that that's a little vague. It sounds a little bit like an essay or an opinion piece. And you need to be very, if you're focused and you have specific examples, then you're getting somewhere.
All right, well, if I could just use one from 2003, Sean Hannity did an interview with a survivor of 9/11, and he inflated the interview from being, you were there in 9/11 and you don't trust the government, to George Bush had direct knowledge of 9/11 before it happened and did nothing to stop it.
So what you're getting into is you're sort of setting yourself up as, I'm going to prove Fox News is wrong. I mean, that's a big job. You're essentially setting yourself up as a commentator on what a cable network is doing. And that doesn't sound to me like a reported piece, that sounds like an opinion piece, in essence.
And I think people do that. I mean, there are reporters or commentators who call each other on those kinds of things. That seems to be happening.
I mean, there are nonprofits or there are sort of watchdog groups,
right.
Media Matters and others, whose whole job it is to watch the channels and fact check MSNBC and Fox all day long. If you came up with something new, it's of interest. But if you just have a thesis, well, they do this all the time, I think we know that.
Okay, next question. And then I have an announcement to make about something else that's coming up that's big, but go ahead.
Hi, I'm Paula, journalism major here at Junior. My question for you is, have you ever been assigned to a story that you fundamentally did not agree with, and how did you go about covering it? And also, has one of you ever published a story that the other fundamentally disagreed with?
You have a story. Well, funny thing about it is that it's the idea that there's a story we disagree with is we don't disagree with stories, because stories have facts, and we're not disagreeing with the facts. You see what I mean?
More so in terms of coverage of events.
If there's a type of subject that we would just refuse to cover, no. You have a response to that? Has there been anything where you said that story's not for me? I don't think I should do that.
Yeah, there's, and I'm trying to think of an example, but there are. It's more of sort of an approach. Like, an editor might come and say, we ought to write about this way, or we ought to be, talking about, maybe there's been one example of something, and we want you to do a big story looking at all of the other examples of that, but it's really not that common, it's really rare. I'm trying to think.
There are examples where an editor will have a preconceived notion that things line up one way, but in fact the facts undercut that. And so part of your job is to push back against that.
I mean, frankly, I kind of do that as part of my job. Is my editor is constantly sending me stuff, and my colleagues, to vet. Is there anything to this study? Is this anything? What if we did this kind of story? I heard this on the radio, and part of my job is to look into it and say, you know what, I think it's really thin, or the research isn't there yet, or just because everybody else is writing about this, I don't think we should, or vice versa. So I do that all the time.
There hasn't been an example, to take the rest of your question, where the two of us have been competing with each other on a story. There have been occasions where our news organizations have competed, but and so we don't tell each other what the other people in our office are doing, but we haven't been out there daily competing on the same story.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Thank you, Paul.
Hi, I'm Christopher Cameron. This question is for Pam specifically. You worked for the San Francisco Chronicle as a freelance journalist. You were working in Manila in the Philippines.
Yes.
You covered stories both in China, South Korea, and other East Asian countries. Can you go a little, this was you coming right out of college. Can you go a little bit into how you got that position and what it was like in working as a foreign correspondent?
So right from college to that.
Right from college. So what I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I wanted to go overseas, and I applied and I got this Fulbright to go to the Philippines. And I went to the Philippines, and before that I deferred it for a little while to take an internship at the Wall Street Journal. So I had 3 months of reporting and writing about tax code and stuff like that. And during that time I wrote to all of these papers all over the place saying, can I write for you? And I'm going to the Philippines. And most of them either didn't reply, I remember distinctly that the New York Times foreign editor at the time wrote me a letter saying that basically we already have somebody there, but he had misspelled Philippines.
Their correspondent had misspelled the Philippines?
Foreign editor.
Oh, the editor misspelled the
Philippines.
That's a tough one.
But the San Francisco Chronicle sent me this note back saying, we think your idea to write for us would be just dandy. Why don't you stop on your way if you're stopping in San Francisco, which I was, or I did. And I met with them, and they said, look, when you're there, call us, and we'll see. And I landed, and 6 weeks later, Marcos was in his room. And so I was on the ground, not that many people were on the ground. I had this amazing story, I had no idea what I was doing, but I hustled, and I asked questions, and I, did stuff, and all of a sudden I had all of these strings, and I was writing for all sorts of places. And ultimately, the Chronicle put me kind of on a contract. They paid for some office space for me, so I had like a regular routine. And they would send me around to China.
One of the advantages of journalism always has been, and I think still is today, is that there's no credential required to do it. Journalism education is helpful, but it's not required. Being the child of someone who did it for a living is not required. There's no license to do it. And so what we usually don't have as young journalists is a clue. But what we do have is energy. And often you can make up for being clueless by you don't know whom to call, but you can stay up all night making calls. And so it often is a young person's game that you can compete with others who have a lot more experience. You won't get all the stories that they get, but they won't be getting the ones you're getting either.
And Nick has about baptism by fire. I mean, I learned so much. It was the best thing I ever did.
Thank you.
Last question, then one closing comment. Go.
Hello, my name is Reed, and my question for you is, were there any obstacles early on in your career that you had to overcome before succeeding in your profession?
Biggest obstacles. Obstacle you face in trying to get where you are.
I think the obstacle, there were the sort of obstacles of publishers who wouldn't publish stories that you wrote because they were a battle advertiser. That's one kind of obstacle. I think another obstacle is just trying to find the right path for yourself. As a young reporter in sort of the post-Watergate era, I had this sort of idea that, Washington would be where you're supposed to go, and that there's some progression from City Hall to covering the State House to covering the White House. And it didn't take me long to realize that official coverage didn't interest me much. Being a government reporter was not, and that what I really wanted was freedom, time to dig into things deeply. And it took me a couple of years to sort of stumble into that a little bit and say, oh, I like that, I'd like to do that again, and then to push to get more of that time. And so I think the obstacle may be trying to figure out, some people start as editors, and then they realize that reporters are having more fun. Some people start as reporters and then realize that they really are better suited to be an editor. They have the skills for that. I think finding the right niche, you wouldn't think of as an obstacle, but it might not happen in 6 weeks or 6 years that you quite find the right job for you. You have to be patient about that and be flexible. Try lots of different aspects of the business.
Obstacle? Did you face any obstacle other than your days as a Newsday carrier?
Being a Newsday carrier was a tough job.
Right.
So, I think honestly the only obstacles are the ones I put in front of myself. Just trying to be better at stuff, trying to find another way around it, trying to, just do something more. I've been very fortunate in that, and I think this business is one that really does allow you to make your own opportunities if you keep working at it.
So you know what I love, just to conclude, thank you, about these 2 books that they wrote. They're so instructive for me because I finished Bill's book. I haven't read Pam's book yet. So Bill stumbles upon this story, and it turns into a book, and now it's been optioned for a movie. Pam told me that she gets the idea for this book when she sees a little note in an Tufts alumni magazine that there's only one doctor on all of Nantucket. And she said, that might be a neat little story. She does a 900-word story, becomes a book, and now it's being optioned for a TV series. You never know where your stories are going. You never know what's going to happen. Your stories are everywhere, and they can take such wonderful direction here. And what they evolve into, it's amazing. Just remember that every time you go out and you find a story, you don't know where it's going or its potential to grow into something bigger. So now will you please join with me in thanking our two guests for